We're looking at John chapter 2, and this is the first of the miracles which Jesus performs. Jesus changes water into wine. Let me read to you the whole passage from verse 1 to verse 11. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Dear woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My time has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now, draw out some and take it to the master of the banquet." And they did so. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn it knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." This, the first of his miraculous signs, Jesus performed in Cana of Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. Okay, this is a very famous passage and a very famous miracle, and one which is not easily explained away as those who like to explain miracles away do, because whereas other miracles may have possible alternatives if you hunt for them, this one is very hard to explain away as a miracle. But let's take it from the top. Let's try and understand exactly what it says to us, what the implications might be. Chapter 2 starts off by saying, "on the third day." And this is a mark of John's Gospel, because we've already seen that previously in the first chapter it was the next day, and the next day, and the next day. And this is on the third day. It's kind of like keeping an account of the 7 days of creation, or it seems a parallel to that. And this third day, one doesn't know why one would say that on the third day, unless, well, it simply happened 3 days later. Jesus was leaving for Galilee, it says, when Jesus called Philip and Nathanael. And he asked Philip to follow him, and Nathanael came too, and they no doubt went to Cana in Galilee. We can see why he was leaving for Galilee now, because he had an appointment there. He was due to be at a wedding. And it was important to be at a wedding, particularly if it was a member of your own family whose wedding you were attending. This was clearly somebody who was known to Jesus and probably, almost certainly, related to Jesus. We don't know what the relationship was. We don't know who they were because we're not told. But one can assume from the nature of the interaction here that Jesus was someone who was looked to as sorting out some of the problems in this time of the wedding. And interestingly enough, that would put Jesus quite close indeed to the person who was being married. So it's possible that it may have been one of his cousins, or it may even have been one of his own sisters who was getting married here. So a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee, but we're not told who it was. And you might ask, why are we not told? And the answer can only be because who it was not important. The relationship between Jesus and the people involved is not the important element in this story. What is, in the events that took place, and the way in which Jesus was in authority and in command of the situation, and the way in which he was looked to as the authority and the one in command and the one who could sort out problems. That's interesting because whenever you meet with different people, you can find that there are some people who you would never go to ask them to sort a problem out because you wouldn't have any hope that they'd be able to do so. And yet there are some other people who, by their attitude, by the way in which they hold themselves, by the way in which they speak, by the way in which they have a kind of personal authority, you know that you can rely upon that kind of person to sort out problems and difficulties as they arise. What strikes you from this simple passage is that Jesus certainly carried himself in the kind of way that people looked to him as the person who could sort out problems, even at this stage, even earlier on, even before his ministry had properly started. He was the kind of person who people looked to save them from the problems that they had. He was the one that they went to. He was the one that they could depend upon and rely upon to deal with the issues. So, you have here a character, and it's a character which I think is something which personally is good to emulate and to achieve in one's own life, to be the kind of person that one looks to when all else around you is failing, to be the kind of character who, when there's a problem, people can come to you because they know that you're the one who would be able to fix it. Developing that kind of a character usually takes a lifetime to do so. But here in this case, Jesus was about 30 years old. And when the wine was gone, which was unusual, which means that the wedding feast was running out of the very ingredient which made most weddings go well, when the wine was gone, there was a problem. And the problem fell upon Jesus' mother, which is interesting in and of itself. Now, it's been speculated here that the reason why the problem fell upon Jesus' mother was because maybe it was in fact Jesus' sister who was being married off here. It would have been a bit of a disgrace to find that the family was so poor that they couldn't afford to buy enough wine. And Jesus' mother was therefore troubled by this. We might ask, where was Joseph at this time? And there is no mention of Joseph from the time of the Nativity onwards. One can only speculate that maybe he was no longer around, maybe he had died, or maybe for some other reason was no longer available. So there's no further mention of him, and Jesus' mother is the one who carries the responsibility for this, seemingly. Either that, or it's merely a side issue to say that, look, they haven't got any wine, like gossip running around a group of people. Jesus' mother, either way, Jesus' mother said to him, they have no more wine. Now, the really startling thing here, out of all of this passage, I think the thing which stands out most strongly as being unusual, as being like a slap in the face, really, is this reply. Dear woman, why do you involve me? Jesus replied, my time has not yet come. Now, if anything, there's two prongs to this response. One is it's enigmatic, which means that it's a strange, mysterious kind of reply. My time has not yet come. What's that got to do with them running out of wine? It seems incredibly incongruous to say such a thing as, my time has not yet come. And, dear woman, why do you involve me? In other words, what's it got to do with me? And, dear woman, that's a strange way to address your mother. Dear woman, why do you involve me? It's very hands-off like. It's as if to say, you're not even my mother. The way you address someone like that, you don't address your mother as dear woman, unless I'm missing something. So there is a kind of a distance here. There's a reluctance to be involved. And yet, despite that reluctance to be involved, Jesus does as he is requested. Possibly because if this is his mother speaking to him, He wants to show respect. Honour your father and mother may well be the issue at hand here. But, dear woman, why do you involve me? We have to really grapple with this term, dear woman. What is that about? Why does he say, dear woman? Some people have tried to soften that particular blow and suggest that maybe the emphasis should be on dear, so that you are dear to me, you are important in my life, I value and treasure you as a son does a mother. But the word woman is out of place. It's ectopic. It seems odd. It seems unusual. Dear mother might be more appropriate, but he certainly doesn't use the term dear mother. Why do you involve me? The way I see it here is that Jesus deliberately puts a distance between him and his earthly mother because his mind is on entirely heavenly things. He's in a different world and comes from a different place. He was with God in the beginning, and he was God. And therefore, the relationship between him and his mother is somewhat different from the relationship between an ordinary human being and their mother. The person who is born of ordinary human parents has their very existence given to them by their parents. They're born from the parents themselves. But Jesus didn't have that relationship. Wasn't a mother in the same sense that his very existence comes from his parents because he existed beforehand. And therefore there is naturally a distance between him and his human parents. And that, I think, may well be reflected in this phrase, dear woman. There's a consequence here which I think is an echo of way back, that you are related to me in an important way, and I take note of you, but my existence is self-existence, and I have an existence outside of my relationship with you, which the rest of us don't have. I think that might be behind that kind of distance between them. Why do you involve me? Well, the implication here is, presumably, you know that I can do something about this. Jesus replied, my time has not yet come. And all that can mean to me is that I'm not prepared to do something until I've started my ministry. And in many ways, Jesus' hand is almost forced here by his mother to start sooner than maybe he expected. It is a mysterious phrase, and I'm not sure that I've got to the bottom of it yet. My time has not yet come has echoes of the crucifixion and the resurrection, which is miraculous in and of itself. My time has not yet come may mean the start of the ministry, which means the start of preaching of the gospel, accompanied by miraculous signs. My time has not yet come may mean that the signs which I do, any miracles or powerful demonstrations of godlike power, need to be tied into the proclamation of the truth which I make, and not merely as a stunt for a wedding. But nevertheless, there is this rebuff from Jesus in this term that, why are you involving me? My time has not yet come. This is no concern of mine. And yet, there is an implicit understanding that there is nowhere else to turn to. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Again, one gets the feeling that we haven't got the entire conversation here. But the important salient points are this, that she leaves it in his hands. She doesn't know what he might do. She's got no concern anymore, but she's passed the responsibility onto Jesus to deal with. That is an important element that I've mentioned earlier on, that the passing of responsibility onto Jesus to do things is something which would take him through the rest of his life, indeed to the end of his life, as responsibility is continually shouldered by this person to be responsible for sorting out problems. And the fact that Mary could instruct the servants to do things suggests that maybe they were her servants. Maybe this was her household, and maybe this was her daughter who was being married. Who knows? I think that's quite a likely scenario. I think that it may well have been one of Jesus' own sisters. It may well have been that Mary was the one who was the real head of the family that was left because Joseph wasn't there. And there was someone else, this master of ceremonies, master of the banquet, who was brought in because it wasn't suitable for a woman to be a master of a banquet in this way. So that may have been an uncle or a friend who was able to be the master of ceremonies. Anyway, nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. If you like, that's the size of a tank for a large SUV car, so a petrol tank. So you're filling up a huge amount of 6 of these cars. That's a huge amount of wine to be dealing with. Fill them up with water, he says. Now, in those days, they'd have to fill them up by going to the well. So the servants would take their buckets, they'd tramp off to the well, and they'd bring the water back and tip it into the jars. It might take some time to do that, because the buckets would not be, there may be a gallon or two to each. So we're talking about 20 to 30 gallons. That's 20 to 30 trips, and that's 6 of them. So that's 620s, 120 trips, maybe 150 trips to fill those water jars up. That would take some time to do that. So, with Jesus standing around and his disciples watching and wondering what on earth is going on here, because during this time they must have been perplexed. They must have been thinking, this doesn't make any sense. What's the point of filling these jars up with water? And it's taking half an hour to do so. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water, so they filled them to the brim. And they did it without question. That's interesting again, because the implication here is that Jesus is a person who speaks with authority. Despite the fact that what is being asked to be done here doesn't make any sense. It is a pointless task. It's not going to solve the problem. We've run out of wine. There's not much point in having water. So, but nevertheless, they spend half an hour or so trudging backwards and forwards from the well to do that. So they filled it up. Now, he said, draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. So the water is in the jars. They draw it out for tasting, presumably. It's a tasting element. So if you go for wine tasting, they draw water out of a cask with a large ladle, maybe, and they put it into some receptacle, a cup, and they take it to the master of the banquet for his approval, for him to say, will this wine do? So the master of the banquet is being appealed to by this James, because they don't just dish it out to everybody. They send it to him first, rather like the main taster, and he pronounces something about the wine. They did so. The master of the banquet tasted the water, which had been turned into wine. He didn't know where it had come from. He didn't know that it was water poured out from the well, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. They must have been astonished. Because after all, when they draw the water out and put it into the cup or whatever it may have been, they would have seen it look different. Water looks different from wine. Wine is red, usually. And that's taken then to the master. And they must have known something was really, really odd. They must have been talking amongst themselves. They must have been astonished. They must have been amazed. There's this contrast then between the servants and the master of the banquet. He didn't realise where it had come from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew. Their astonishment must have been great. Then he called the bridegroom aside, and he said to him, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink." That's because after you've had something to drink, well, your sensibilities are degraded. If you've had something to drink, you don't see things clearly very well. There's an argument here that the senses, the perceptions, they are made worse by the fact that you're drunk. And therefore you can quite safely bring in the poor quality wine, the wine which tastes a bit more like vinegar, and then drink that down, and that would be more available to you. So in those days, they would have brought the best wine out first, and then the worst wine would follow. And so the master of the banquet was expecting worse quality wine to come. But he was astonished too, that everyone brings out the cheaper wine afterwards, after the guests have had too much to drink. Too much means their senses are dulled, but you have saved the best till now. In other words, his senses haven't been dulled. He hasn't drunk too much because he's able to tell the difference between the two. Master of ceremonies, the master of the banquet, is someone who's a discerning fellow. And the implication here is important because this is kind of the best wine. What Jesus creates here from water into wine is the best that there could be. And that's the nature of the work that Jesus does. It's high quality. It's not cutting corners. It's not skimpy. It's not something which you just get away with it. It's something which is done fully, properly, completely, to the best of his ability, and producing the very greatest. Well, of course, if he indeed is the Word of God and the creator of all things, turning water into wine is just a corollary of that position. If you accept Jesus as the Word of God, as the one who was at the beginning creating everything, then this is an act of creation here. It echoes Genesis again, that the one who created everything in Genesis chapter 1 is the one who created wine in John chapter 2. On the third day, he created this wine from nothing but water. It's a miraculous event, and it's one which shows the reliability of Jesus. It shows the way in which you can depend on him to sort problems out which are normally insoluble. And it shows that the quality of his work and solution is of the very finest and the highest. All of this then points to the importance of this story and what the implications are that we can take away. This, the first of his miraculous signs, Jesus performed in Cana of Galilee, and thus revealed his glory. That revealing his glory, one gives the impression that this is something which maybe he was keen to avoid. In fact, as Jesus performs miracles, he often tells people, "Don't tell anyone that I've done this." And as this reluctance brings you back to the phrase at the start, "My time has not yet come." What does that mean? He didn't wish to reveal his glory at this point. And that was where the reluctance comes from. But nevertheless, by performing this act, he did reveal his glory. But to those who saw, not to everyone. I think the rest of the wedding guests didn't know anything about it. Certainly the master of ceremonies didn't know. But the disciples knew, and the servants knew. And the consequence of that was his disciples put their faith in him. Putting their faith in him means that they look to Jesus Christ as the Messiah, as the one who will save his people from their sins, as the one who will, in fact, take the responsibility upon himself of sorting out the problems that each of us actually carries themselves, problems which we would carry to our deaths in the grave and to the day of judgment. But Jesus Christ will shoulder that responsibility on our behalf. And that's really the message of the miracle at Cana.